everyone, and welcome to Chapter 12. So I feel like I say this pretty much every time I record a video lately, but unfortunately I still am feeling a little bit under the weather, so I apologize in advance for any sniffling or coughing you might hear. So Chapter 12 is on personality. So basically in this chapter we're going to start by talking about some of the newer theories of personality, the more trait-based theories, and kind of how they came to be developed, and then we'll talk a bit about some of the biological and cultural considerations when we're talking about personality development, and then finally we'll end with talking about the psychodynamic theory of personality development, which is largely based on the work of Sigmund Freud, and we'll talk a tiny bit at the end about the humanist theories as well. But the majority of Module 3 is definitely based on Freud and his psychodynamic theories. So the first module is called Contemporary Approaches to Personality. So personality defined is essentially a characteristic pattern of thinking, feeling, and behaving that are unique to each individual and remain relatively consistent over time and situations. So that's something to kind of keep in mind when we're talking about personality. We don't tend to say that something, the way that one person reacts in any given situation is indicative of their personality. Personality is more kind of, we're referring to the traits and characteristics that remain stable kind of across a lifespan for the most part. So when we're trying to figure out people who we know very well and kind of understand their personality, we tend to adopt what we call an idiographic approach. So basically we're focused on creating detailed descriptions of a specific person's unique personality characteristics. So it's very much more based on the individual. On the other hand, when psychologists study large groups of people, they take what we call a nomothetic approach. So they examine personality in large groups of people with the aim of making generalizations about personality structure. So idiographic is focused on the individual and kind of uncovering the basics, I guess, of their personality and how it was shaped, whereas the nomothetic approach is more relevant to kind of larger groups of people and trends across groups, not focused on the individual. So early trait research, because as we know, most of our theories these days that relate to personality are kind of based in the concept of kind of personality traits. So a trait would be something that describes a specific psychological characteristic that makes up a part of a person's personality. So it kind of tells us how they are, how they react most of the time in most situations. So in the 1930s, a psychologist named Gordon Allport tallied nearly 18,000 English words that could be used to describe physical and psychological attributes. So all of these words that you could use to describe somebody and the way that they do things and the way that they think, he basically took all of those words and then organized them into what he called traits. And this kind of launched a trend that continued in personality psychology and continues to this day. So basically, because of his idea that you could take all of these different characteristics and find underlying traits for them, that's a large part of why we now base most of our theories of personality on personality traits. So it's often easier to make people believe you are measuring their personality than it is to actually measure it. I think I remember talking to you way back in Chapter 2 when we were talking about research and kind of critical thinking, and basically we discussed a little bit about how things like the MMPI, which is the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, that is like a really good test for personality. It's something that's actually got scientific evidence behind it, whereas things like the Myers-Briggs test of personality, even though those are really popular and done by a lot of people, they're more pseudoscience-y. So there are, some good kind of scientifically validated ways of examining personality, but there are also a lot of kind of really silly quizzes and things online, and even some that sound a lot more scientific, like Myers-Briggs, that don't really have the empirical support behind them. So I think I mentioned Barnum effects back then too, but basically the Barnum effect kind of refers to the ease with which we can convince people that a personality profile describes them well. And so essentially, if you write a personality profile in vague enough terms that it could apply to almost anyone, then it's very likely that people will read it and kind of take it to be with themselves. So they're much more likely to believe it if it's something that's kind of very easy for them to internalize. So we'll see an example of what I'm talking about here. So there was a scientist named Bertram Forer, and he basically provided the following profile to all of the participants in his study, regardless of their answers on a personality test. So he gave them a personality test and he said, based on your responses here, you're going to receive a description of yourself. And so basically he gave them all this description no matter how they answered the questions. And then at the end, he asked them to rate how well it described them. So 0 being not at all and 5 being excellent. And astonishingly, despite the fact that it was the exact same description given to everybody and wasn't tailored in any way to any particular participant, the average rating of how well it described the participants was 4.26 out of 5. So 5 being excellent. So pretty much all of the participants were very likely to read this profile, and because it was kind of written so generally that it could apply to almost anyone, they really kind of internalized it and thought, you know, this is really an accurate result, like it really describes me very well. So in contrast to these more kind of pseudoscience-y ways of describing personality, empirical research over the past several decades has narrowed down potential personality traits into a small number of factors. So we've used a technique called factor analysis, which again, I believe I mentioned to you in the last class, maybe in chapter 2, when we were talking about research methods. And it basically is a technique used to group items that people respond to similarly. So for example, things like friendly, warm, and kind, those all probably have some kind of underlying characteristic that kind of brings them all together. So in that respect, they would kind of be grouped together as one factor during factor analysis. So in 1946, Raymond Cattell used factor analysis to narrow the list of key personality traits. So he's kind of expanding on the work of Allport at this point, and he narrowed the list down to 16 key personality traits. Then 40 years later, so quite some time has passed, McCrae and Costa created what we call the 5-factor model of personality. You may have also heard it referred to as OCEAN, and I'll show you why in a minute. And basically it's a trait-based theory of personality based on the finding that personality can be described using 5 major dimensions. And this model has actually become the most popular trait-based approach for academic personality researchers. So in terms of our kind of go-to models for personality these days, the 5-factor model is pretty much one of the best out there in terms of, you know, what we use in our research and what we believe to be kind of empirically validated. So here's kind of a picture of the different dimensions that are a part of this 5-factor model. And the reason I told you a minute ago that we call it OCEAN is if you look on the side here, you can see if you look at kind of the openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism, you can see that the first letters of each of those words spell out the acronym OCEAN. So that's why a lot of the time we'll refer to the 5-factor model of personality as the OCEAN model. And so basically what McCrae and Costa were saying was that each of these is kind of a different dimension, and any individual can kind of fall, you know, towards either end of each dimension. So for example, you have your dimension of openness, and so if somebody scores kind of high in openness, they would be more creative, artistic, curious, imaginative, non-conforming, whereas someone scoring low would be kind of more resistant to change, so conventional, down to earth. Conscientiousness, we've got ambitious, organized, reliable, whereas the opposite of conscientiousness would be more kind of like unreliable, lazy, casual, and spontaneous. Extroversion, you've probably heard of the word extrovert before, so the kind of opposite end of the dimension for this one would be introversion. And so an extrovert, if somebody scores high in extroversion, they'd be social, enjoying high levels of stimulation, whereas somebody scoring low on extroversion and kind of in response to that, it will be high on introversion. They're going to be showing more reserved personality. They enjoy lower levels of stimulation. So you can kind of see, you know, how each of these operates on kind of a spectrum from, you know, high in one particular trait to low in it. And sometimes you can even see the opposite end. So, you know, extroversion would be introversion, agreeableness would be disagreeableness, neuroticism, the opposite of that would be emotional instability. Or sorry, emotional stability, because neuroticism is emotional instability. So I know I just kind of briefly went through each of those in that table, but here's a little bit more information about each for you. So you should definitely keep in mind all 5 of these dimensions and be able to kind of describe some characteristics that would correlate to, you know, either being high or low in each of them. So for openness, someone who's high would be more dreamers, creative types, open to new things. Low is going to be defenders of the system, avoid the unknown, prefer things that are tangible, so they're much more resistant to change, whereas openness would be kind of associated with openness to change and trying new things. For extroversion, again, the high are the socializers, sensation seekers. They're comfortable in stimulating environments. They tend to be talkative, enthusiastic, outgoing, fun to be around, but at times they can take things a bit too far as well. Whereas on the low side of the spectrum, we have, the quiet ones. They need more time for solitary activities. They enjoy spending time on their own, and they can be overwhelmed by high stimulation. So overall, people who are more introverted or kind of score lower in extroversion would be a bit more cautious and reserved than the ones that score high in extroversion. For agreeableness, we have people who are high showing warmth and friendliness. They tend to be kind, compassionate, empathetic, so kind of understanding of how other people are feeling. They tend to be pretty helpful and altruistic, meaning that they kind of help out others even if there's really no benefit to themselves. And they make great team members, but not really great leaders, because of course if somebody is a bit too agreeable, it can be really hard for them to kind of assert themselves and kind of take charge. So they're great to be on a team with because they'll kind of do whatever you say, but they're not so good at actually trying to lead. The opposite of that for agreeableness, someone who's low would put themselves first. They value being authentic, so they're not really people pleasers like the agreeable people. They'd be more likely to kind of let it be known if they were in disagreement with something that was going on. They can be seen as cold, unfriendly, or uncooperative and unkind, and they don't seem to experience much empathy. For conscientiousness, people who are high in conscientiousness are very organized and efficient. They tend to be dependable, punctual, meet deadlines, and plan ahead. And in general, they tend to make great students and employees because they are kind of aware of people around them and how their actions affect others. Whereas people who are lower in conscientiousness tend to be more easygoing and fun to hang around with, but they can definitely be bad group members because their laissez-faire attitude towards everything kind of leads them to kind of not really put their full effort forward in a lot of times. They tend to be more disorganized and careless with details and bad with deadlines. And then finally, neuroticism, and it's always been interesting to me that this is the only one where kind of the main word we use is kind of the negative end of the scale. With all the other ones, people tend to think it's better to be kind of higher in conscientiousness, openness, extroversion, and agreeableness, whereas with neuroticism, that's the one you don't want to be high in. So high neuroticism is someone who is difficult to deal with. They're emotionally volatile, so their emotions are kind of all over the place. They tend to experience a high level of negative emotions, and they tend to be sensitive and very easily stressed. So people who are high in neuroticism tend to be a lot more vulnerable to mood disorders such as depression or bipolar disorders, things like that. Whereas people who are low in neuroticism, that's actually kind of the better end of the scale in this case. And that would mean people who are kind of prototypically mentally healthy, they're secure and they're confident, they're able to let go of negative emotions easily, and they tend to be overall pretty good at managing their emotions. So again, like I said, with neuroticism, the opposite end of the scale is kind of more emotional stability, because neuroticism is essentially, in essence, emotional instability. So taken together, if we look at these big 5 factors, they're very useful in terms of understanding other people's behavior, thoughts, and emotions, but psychologists often find that there are other traits that lay outside of these dimensions. So if you look at those, you'll see that, there's a kind of a positive and a negative end to each in a way, but none of them really seem kind of strong enough, I guess, to describe somebody who commits, truly evil crimes or does things that's really destructive to other people or to things in their environment. And so what we're kind of missing from the Big 5 model of personality is an explanation for what kind of a person would do these things, such as, abuse children, engage in wartime atrocities and torture and things like that. And so early research suggested the presence of what became known as an authoritarian personality, which was theorized to be very rigid and dogmatic in their thinking and to separate the world into us versus them. So very much, if you're not with us, you're against us. You're either kind of in our group or you're an outsider. And unfortunately, this kind of us-them thinking often leads to people within those groups believing that the us is superior. And unfortunately, that means a lot of the time they're more likely to endorse and engage in prejudice and violence, particularly towards the them. So because, that's not the group they're a part of, they look down on it and see it as being kind of a negative thing. So very much kind of that black and white, us versus them mentality. Michael Ashton and his colleagues at Brock University, they actually kind of took the 5-factor model one step further. So they developed what was known as the hexaco model of personality. It's a 6-factor theory instead of 5-factor that typically kind of replicates the first 5 factors that were included in the FFM or the 5-factor model, and then adds on one additional dimension, which is that of honesty, humility. So individuals who score highly on this factor, if they're, honest and score high in humility as well, they tend to be sincere, honest, and modest, whereas those with low scores are deceitful, greedy, and pompous. So the hexaco model was kind of, again, trying to get at that component that was really missing from the 5-factor model, which was the dimension that would kind of explain why people do such terrible things sometimes. So they would basically state that people who are high in honesty and humility are more likely to perform altruistic and pro-social behaviors, whereas those who score low on honesty and humility harbor more selfish, antisocial, and violent tendencies. So their contribution to this model in adding that factor was to give something that did kind of at least begin to represent that more, I guess we could say, kind of evil side of humanity. Low honesty, humility scores tend to feel a strong sense of self-importance as well as a feeling of entitlement, and therefore this hexaco model seems to describe evil as heavily involving an excessive importance placed on self. And that's something when we go through the next few models that we're about to talk about, you'll see as something that's kind of in common with all of these models that are describing somebody who does bad things to other people. It typically, there's some kind of aspect of the person being heavily self-involved or feeling like their self, they themselves are more important than the other people in their environment. So now we get to talk about the dark triad. And honestly, this is something that I had only heard about a few years ago for the first time, and I find it really interesting because, again, as we mentioned, with that original 5-factor model, there isn't really anything that really describes kind of the sense of evil or wrongdoing that some people kind of engage in. And so this was actually developed by researchers at the University of British Columbia, so not too far away. And they uncovered 3 traits that they believe are central in understanding the personality roots of evil. So they referred to these 3 traits as the dark triad, which is Machiavellianism, psychopathy, and narcissism. And so basically, somebody who is high in these 3 traits, it would basically be described as socially destructive, aggressive, dishonest, and likely to commit harm in general. So people who are high in these traits tend to, again, like I just mentioned, give an excessive importance to self and little to no importance to others. So just to go through the 3 traits individually to kind of explain a little bit about them. Machiavellianism describes a tendency to use people and to be manipulative and deceitful. So individuals who score high in Machiavellianism, they basically lack respect for others. They tend to focus on their own self-interest. They're really not concerned about the safety and the well-being of others. They approach relationships strategically, and they basically only begin relationships with people that they feel could be of some benefit to them. So they use others for how they might provide benefit to themselves. Psychopathy, which I'm sure is something you've all heard of, describes a general tendency towards having shallow emotional responses. So people who are true psychopaths actually, they show kind of a lack of emotional reaction, even physiologically. So it really, psychopathy is really associated kind of with a deadening of emotional range and emotional capability. And so individuals who are high in this trait, they tend to seek out highly stimulating environments, and they tend to feel little empathy for others because, of course, as we just mentioned, they have a really hard time kind of feeling emotions at all. They may get a thrill out of conflict, and they feel little remorse for their actions. And honestly, psychopathy is one of the things that has fascinated me the most in terms of mental illness, and when we talk about personality disorders and things like that. I actually wrote a giant paper on it last semester for my psychopathology class. So if you're interested in psychopathy, then definitely let me know and I can give you a little bit more information about it. But for the purposes of this class, basically you just kind of need to know what's written here. So you're going to view psychopathy as just one of the 3 components of this dark triad. Then we have narcissism, which again is something you've probably heard of. It reflects an egotistical preoccupation with the self-image and an excessive sense of self-importance. So again, we get that kind of characteristic trait of feeling more important than others and feeling like you are worth more than others around you. And narcissism especially is a trait that's really highly associated with, increased self-importance, thinking that narcissists are people who really think they are the most important, and they basically they can be very charming to other people, but they're difficult to form relationships with because they will always put themselves first. So they're never really going to consider the needs of others. The real power of these three traits comes when we consider them all together. So on their own, they're all pretty awful at times. People who score high on these traits can be really manipulative, deceitful. They can have the ability to hurt people without feeling any sense of remorse. But when you combine all three of them together, that's basically when you get these really strong antisocial tendencies and a really high increased likelihood of committing harm to others. So now we want to talk briefly about right-wing authoritarianism, which is kind of another theory of how some people might go along and do things that would be considered evil or kind of wrong by, in terms of a typical moral standpoint. And this one was actually kind of come up with by some researchers at the University of Manitoba. So again, very close to home. A lot of great personality research going on here in Canada. And so some researchers there have identified right-wing authoritarianism. And basically they call this a problematic set of personality characteristics that also predisposes people to certain types of violent or antisocial tendencies. So people who are right-wing authoritarians basically involves three key tendencies. They tend to obey orders and defer to established authorities in society. So basically they kind of follow the leader. Whoever is in power is the one that they kind of look up to, and they will do basically whatever is told of them by those who are in power. They also tend to support aggression against those who dissent or differ from the established social order. So anyone who kind of doesn't step in line and follow authority, they can react really negatively to. And they believe very strongly in maintaining the existing social order. So they don't really want any groups to kind of get ahead and things like that. They want things to kind of stay the way they are. Where, some groups are treated less favorably than others just based on, things like skin tone or sex or all those other factors. So right-wing authoritarianism basically is kind of almost the opposite of kind of social justice in a lot of ways. So people who have the characteristics that are associated with right-wing authoritarianism, they tend to lead to a strong tendency to think in terms of black and white with no shades of gray. So if you committed a crime, that's it, you're guilty, you should be punished. There's no kind of gray area, there's no justification or reasoning. It's, you basically step out of line and you should be punished for it, and that's kind of all there is. So those who are high in right-wing authoritarianism tend to hold strong beliefs that are highly resistant to change, and they are generally more prejudiced than people who are kind of lower in RWA. RWAs are also more likely to advocate a harsher stance towards those who deviate from established social order. So I kind of mentioned this a minute ago, but people who kind of go against the way things have always been, such as feminists, atheists, and ethnic minorities, RWAs tend to kind of dislike and distrust people in those groups who are trying to kind of go against social order. People who are high in RWA are also more likely to agree with unethical decisions that are made by leaders. So again, they are very much kind of agree with whoever's in authority and do whatever is told of them. So therefore, it doesn't matter even if the person who is in charge does some terrible things, they're still going to agree with it because that's, the person who makes the rules. So they tend to be more likely to agree with unethical decisions if they're made by leaders, and they also have more positive attitudes towards corrupt governments as well. They were likely very instrumental in the rise of fascism that led to World War II. So you can kind of definitely see some similarities there if you think of kind of what happened in World War II with Hitler and, kind of trying to eradicate an entire group of people. And, the characteristics that are associated with RWA would definitely kind of describe a lot of Hitler's followers and kind of his henchmen, so to speak, pretty well. So the theory on RWA shares with the previous two theories, and I kind of mentioned this as we went along, an emphasis on people who have an excessive sense of self-importance. So again, with all kind of three theories of why people might kind of behave badly in terms of their personality, they all share that common trait of exaggerated self-importance. And so in RWAs, this manifests in certainty and unwavering conviction in their opinions. So they are right, and kind of that is all there is to it. They're listening to what's being told to them, they're following orders, and therefore they're doing the right thing. There is no kind of gray area or no other alternative to the way that they're thinking. So your text actually goes a little bit more into detail with the right-wing authoritarianism, and they talk about it a bit more at the group level. So your text examines the impact of the RWA personality at the group level using the scientific literacy model. So as we just discussed, personality researchers have identified RWA as a cluster of characteristics that essentially make our society a less warm and friendly place. And so it's easy, kind of based on what I've told you so far, to imagine how those who have high RWA might behave in social situations. But what do you think would happen if a group of people who are high in RWA get together? So a group of people who are very into following the rules and, not liking anything that challenges the current kind of status quo and things like that, if they get together, how do you think kind of things would be impacted? And so there was a really interesting study conducted, which basically selected a bunch of people who were either very high in RWA or very low in RWA. And they got them to engage in a really complex role-playing simulation called a global change game. So basically each group in this game typically contains between 50 to 70 participants, or people, I guess, playing the game. In this case, I think there was 68 in one group and 67 in the other. And so basically individuals are organized into groups for each different region of the world. They get to make decisions about how each group kind of behaves internationally, and each simulation is meant to cover kind of 40 years into the Earth's future. And so basically what happened is in the low RWA group, there were no wars or military buildup, so they went through the whole 40 years of the simulation, and they all managed to kind of get along and do relatively well together and come through relatively unscathed. Whereas in the group with high RWA, their first game led to a global nuclear war that wiped out humanity very, very quickly. So they weren't even able to make it to the end of the 40-year simulation because they basically had blown each other up. And so they allowed that high RWA group to have a second chance just to kind of try again. And you think that maybe they might have learned from their mistakes. But no, the second time they did make it to the 40-year point, but at that point, essentially, everyone on Earth was kind of divided into armed camps, which were on the brink of an all-out war. So basically what this kind of shows us is that it seems when a bunch of people who are high in right-wing authoritarianism get together, if one acts negatively or violently or acts out in any way, then the others all perceive them as kind of attacking, and then they retaliate and kind of return in favor, and it can lead to some really disastrous consequences. So you can imagine kind of the impact of having people in government, especially in high positions of government, who are high in this type of trait, because obviously it's something that's associated with a lot of really devastating consequences. So now we're going to talk briefly about personality traits over the lifespan. So one of the most fascinating issues in personality psychology is whether we stay the same or whether our fundamental personalities change as we age. And as I told you back at the beginning, when we're talking about personalities, we tend to think of them as kind of relatively stable. And indeed, a vast amount of research has revealed considerable stability in our personalities. We know that there is a large genetic contribution to personality, which we'll talk a bit more about in the next module. And given that we know that there is definitely this kind of genetic component and that our personalities all the time kind of arise from our temperaments that we're born with, we can kind of say that our personalities began even before we're born. So there are child developmental studies that have found that infants possess different temperaments from birth. So there are 3 kind of general temperaments, and we'll talk about them a bit on the next slide. But in general, we see that some infants are more active and happy, others are more tranquil or calm, and still others are kind of easily upset, the very kind of fussy infants. So therefore, temperament seems to represent an innate biological foundation upon which personality is built. So we'll talk a bit about the different temperaments and some of the things that they can lead to in terms of personality development. So basically what this suggests is that personality traits should be stable over time, and to some extent this is actually confirmed by the research. So we do see infant temperaments, as I mentioned on the last slide, and we do see that they predict the adult personality traits of extroversion, neuroticism, and conscientiousness. So there was a study that basically followed children from age 3 to adulthood, and temperament was shown to be strongly predictive of behavioral tendencies, personality, and life outcomes many years later. So it really did seem like some of the events that were happening, you know, from birth right through childhood, really did have an impact on the later personality development and outcomes. So there were 3 main temperaments identified. Well-adjusted, which were infants who were capable of self-control, they were confident, they weren't really as upset in kind of new situations with strangers, things like that. So they would kind of seem to go along with kind of the more securely attached children that we would have talked about in our development chapter. Then we had under-controlled, which are children who are more impulsive, restless, distractible, and emotionally volatile. And finally, we have inhibited, which are children who tend to be socially uncomfortable. They're pretty fearful, and they tend to get upset easily by kind of strangers or, you know, a close kind of parental figure, guardian kind of leaving, things like that. So you can see how the under-controlled and the inhibited temperaments kind of are associated with the more insecure attachment styles in childhood. And so basically what we ended up seeing was that if you look at the study that kind of followed the children from age 3 into adulthood, the under-controlled children became the most likely to exhibit externalizing behaviors in adolescence, such as fighting, lying, and disobeying, whereas the inhibited children develop mainly internalizing behavioral patterns. So things like worrying, crying easily, ruminating, those are more kind of what we would label as internalizing behaviors. And by age 18, their emerging adult personalities seem to be a pretty good reflection of their temperaments at age 3. So we really did see kind of a general level of stability across the lifespan. So there are a number of behavioral and biological factors that help make our personality stable over time. Our personality processes tend to be basically self-perpetuating. So what that means is they're kind of reinforced, and so we continue engaging in them. So that's kind of something that enables that stability. So for example, if you have someone who's high in conscientiousness, they would probably tend to be pretty punctual and organized and dependable, and all of those traits would probably be more likely to increase their chances of success, which would lead them to, you know, having maybe better jobs, being well respected, creating professional opportunities, and of course, because they got these positive outcomes based on those behaviors, then those behaviors are going to be reinforced, right? So in that respect, we can kind of see almost an aspect of learning theory here, or behaviorism, which we'll talk about in a minute. Insight from neuroscience, so studying the brain, can also help explain the stability. We know, and we talked about this way back in, I think, chapter 3 when we did a bit of biopsych, neurons that fire together wire together. So the more that kind of 2 pathways are activated together, the more they become associated within the brain. And we do see that practice over time will lead to more stability. And researchers analyzing the results of over 150 studies found that personality stability is the lowest for young children and the highest for adults above age 50. So again, like after it's been, you know, so far into life and you've had all these different kind of reinforcements and things that have been kind of activated at the same time and kind of become more stable pathways, we do tend to see a great deal of personality stability in, you know, older adults and as we reach mid to late adulthood. However, we do see recent research that suggests that personality can change, particularly in late adolescence and early adulthood. So we do tend to see overall decreases in neuroticism, so that negative emotionality, and increases in conscientiousness, agreeability, and social dominance as people kind of transition from adolescence into early adulthood and beyond. So here's a little graph that kind of illustrates personality stability and change over lifespan. So you can see that some do kind of typically go up a little bit over time, whereas others kind of decrease a little bit more in some aspects. So in this graph, they kind of, instead of putting neuroticism, they put emotional stability. So the fact that we see emotional stability going up in this graph would indicate to us that neuroticism is going down, because as we have to keep in mind that's kind of the opposite end of that dimension. So in general, the more positive traits tend to become kind of increasingly relevant over the lifespan, and you tend to kind of people tend to kind of shift towards the more positive ends of each of the dimensions. So in contrast to a personality trait, we also have what are known as personality states. And a state is a temporary physical or psychological engagement that influences our behavior. So even people who do seem to be highly consistent in how they express their traits like extroversion, neuroticism, etc., they will still not behave in the exact same way across a large number of different situations. So obviously the situation does influence behavior. It's not just those stable personality traits. So from our general understanding that we think that states and traits typically work together. So traits would describe a person's general personality tendencies, so how they would kind of mostly react in the majority of situations, kind of typical characteristics of the person, whereas states describe what that person is like in very specific sets of circumstances. So there are 4 general aspects of the situation we look at when we're trying to examine what might influence our behavior. The first is location, so for example, whether you're at work, whether you're at school, whether you're home. The second will be association, so whether you're with friends, whether you're alone, whether you're with your family. The third is activities, so things like if you're awake, if you're rushed, if you're studying, kind of whatever behavior or kind of other activity you're engaged in. And then your fourth would be your subjective states, which are things like being mad, sick, drunk, happy, so any of those emotional or physical states at the time of the experience. And so these determine essentially how and when our personality traits are expressed. So again, basically in summary, we have our traits, which are kind of more stable and enduring, and then we have our states, which refer to how we would basically respond in any particular circumstance. So now we're going to talk briefly about some behaviorist and social cognitive perspectives of personality. So most people do tend to be relatively supportive of the trait theories of personality, but they do tend to reinforce certain assumptions. So talking about trait theories, it basically kind of makes us seem like we're kind of carrying these personality characteristics around inside us, and that we have these kind of things known as traits that are kind of with us at all times. However, this approach doesn't really examine how personalities are influenced by our experiences. So we talked a bit about how genetics might influence our personality, but not so much about how our experiences would. And so a behaviorist perspective on personality would note that any identifiable patterns of behavior would be kind of cause for exploration, and they basically want to understand how that behavior was elicited within our environmental conditions. So B.F. Skinner, for example, you may remember him from the chapter on behaviorism and conditioning. He was kind of one of the fathers of operant conditioning. He uses Skinner boxes to kind of observe the behavior of rats. And so he basically would believe that personality was simply a description of the response tendencies that occur in different situations. So in that respect, he would think that the behaviors you engage in are viewed as based on your past experiences. So you were likely reinforced for those behaviors at some point in your past, kind of similar how I talked a few minutes ago about kind of conscientiousness being reinforced by having kind of positive outcomes with it. Behaviorists don't really care so much for kind of the trait names, such as extroversion. They kind of feel that naming them and labeling them is a kind of an unnecessary addition because they don't really help us understand the simple relationship between stimulus and response. So again, anyone who's kind of a strict behaviorist, they're going to be kind of very rigid in their beliefs that nothing really happens unless basically there's a consequence. So either a reinforcement, which makes a behavior or kind of a trait more likely to be displayed, or a punishment, which would make a behavior or trait less likely to be displayed. And then we have the social cognitive perspective. So in the mid-20th century, behaviorism kind of gave way for the emerging social cognitive perspective, which definitely has had a major impact on our understanding of personality. So people who were social cognitive psychologists, such as Albert Bandura, viewed cognitions and a person's interpretation of their circumstances as a very important to personality. So basically what they were saying is the relationship between the person and the environment and how this relationship is affected by the person's thoughts and interpretations is central to our personality. So whereas behaviorism would kind of say that we do what we do because of kind of the reinforcements and punishments for our behavior or the things that are being displayed, whereas social cognitive psychologists say, well, yes, there is a relationship between the person and the environment, but that's also impacted by our thoughts and interpretations as well. So this perspective is kind of differing from behaviorism in that the person ends up forming beliefs, so cognitions about their relationship to the environment. Bandura was very interested in the concept of what we call self-efficacy, which I know we've talked about in a few chapters now, but basically it refers to kind of someone's own sense of their ability, so whether or not they're able to kind of accomplish things that they set out to do. So if someone has high self-efficacy, they feel confident in their abilities, whereas someone with low self-efficacy would feel a lot less confident in their abilities. And so Bandura had this central idea that was called reciprocal determinism, and so he would basically state that the person and the environment co-create each other. So personality emerges from the interactions we see between behavior, internal factors, and external factors. So the internal personal factors of the person, the external situational factors, and the behavior all mutually influence each other. So based on this theory, in order for someone to kind of change a negative personality trait, such as neuroticism, Bandura would say that we would have to take a look at the processes through which the person seemed to express and reinforce the neuroticism. So in this way, we're basically looking to uncover specific leverage points by which we're able to change the processes and thus change the underlying belief system. So it's not just about kind of the consequences, the reinforcements or the punishments, it's also about the way we think of things and the beliefs that we hold. And so the final thing in this module is this little diagram that kind of nicely summarizes the difference between behaviorist accounts of personality and the social cognitive approach. So you can see here in the first diagram, if we're coming from a strictly behavioral perspective, we would state that, the environment leads you to a particular behavior, and whether that behavior, it's going to result in some consequence, whether it's a punishment or a reinforcement, and based on what the consequence is, that would influence whether or not we're more likely to engage in that behavior again. Whereas in the second one here, you can see that using that concept of reciprocal determinism, we have our behaviors, we have our environment, and then we have our personal and cognitive factors, and they all kind of influence each other back and forth. So that's why we call it reciprocal determinism, because it's kind of a give and take rather than just one thing influencing another. So that is it for Module 1. Hopefully you kind of enjoyed this little trip into the history of trait theories of psychology. I know that it was a little long, and I apologize because I am definitely a little bit sniffly and probably rambling a bit, but hopefully you kind of enjoyed the lecture and you got some good information out, and I will talk to you in the next one where we will go through some of the cognitive and biological features of personality. So I will talk to you then.